I'm going to make this a very brief introduction because the sponsors for all of this are written on the program, and because our first reader actually is supposed to be somewhere else 5 minutes ago. And we'd like to actually get into the action. So I'll just say briefly, thank you to everyone who made this possible. You know who you are. And then after that, I'll say briefly, our plan is to have a very brief reading, one poem and its translation by each of the poets who participated. Some of the poems started out their lives in English and were translated into Russian. Some started out in Russian, were translated into English, but the order will always be English first in our readings. And then we're going to have a discussion of translation practice. And I also know that there are a couple of students here who created their versions of the last poem, which is listed in the program. We're going to hear those as well as part of our discussion. If you feel hungry in the course of the event, please go back and get more food because there's a lot of it. And that's all I wanted to say. So we're going to start out with Julia Bloch reading her poem, And the General Will is Indestructible. Is that how? Did I get it right? And the translation, which is going to be read by DMITRY KUZMIN. So please come on up.
This poem is dedicated to Catalina Uyang, and it begins with an epigraph. This little treatise is part of a longer work. The rest no longer exists. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Foreword to the Social Contract. As moan is clamped shut, as routine loses momentum, as she is gyrating, as assertion begins to feel ill, as respondent stands naked, as complainant FaceTimes, as erratic voice recordings, as ultimately voice recordings, as in fact voice recordings, as consent expresses agreement with these beliefs. To be well spoken, to conclude the panel, to agree there was absolutely no physical retaliation in bed together, right of appetite cannot bind justice for instinct. A contract must come from all and apply to all, rescinding.
Это стихотворение называется по названию главы из трактата Руссо об общественном договоре, о том, что общая воля неразрушима, и имеет эпиграф из введения к этой книге. Этот небольшой трактат извлечен мною из более обширного труда, остальное уже более не существует. Руссо об общественном договоре, перевод Хаютина Алексеева-Попова. So this translation, several experts have contributed, including Leonid Schwab, Julia Kolchinsky-Dasbach, Mila Nazirova, Alex Moshkin, and Louise Moshkin. Посвящение Каталине Оуян. И поскольку стоны резко закрыли рот, и поскольку рутина жизни оборвалась, и поскольку заявление делается больным, и поскольку она извертелась, и поскольку ответчик вполне обнажил, и поскольку истица в личке, и поскольку непредсказуемые голосовые сообщения, и поскольку практически голосовые сообщения, и поскольку без конца голосовые сообщения, и поскольку разрешение выражает согласие о признаниях, соблюдать красноречие, заключить присяжных, признать совершенное отсутствие физического возмездия в совместной постели. Право желания не обязывает. Инстинкт справедливостью. Договор должен исходить ото всех и касаться всех, отменяя. Thank you.
Okay, so the next poem is going to be YLME Mikhailik's I'll Reply to the Outer Sea, with a translation read by Sibyllyn Forrester.
Thank you. And thank you to Kevin and Michael and to everyone who's participated. This has been just wonderful. This translation was made by Catherine Chipiela, Chipiela, and Valvina Kaur, and me, and the brilliant ELENA MIKHAILIK. And the title is I'll Reply to the Outer Sea. I'll reply to the outer sea that it should have no significance as a given. It would be of no account, eternal and unchanging, inessential, hence preordained, pre-understood. Transient birds, a chattering brook and grass, live only within non-being, yet while they last, their entirely static sum of moments comprise the time in which I come to pass. Autumn crossed out by a slant, speckled wing, the burning bush tests the road where it might cling, and smoke over the roof won't cancel summer, the chimney-spreading heat doesn't change a thing. And never mind how often your eye blinks just before that second when light goes out above the shore, misreadings, obstacles, tiny details, distortions. That is what ultimately gives us our forms. There where the outer sea herds its humpbacked waves, where bars of sunlight bind the shore like staves, I shall reply that this rarefied creation offers a chance to live outside of fate. Neither the knowledge of good and evil, nor hope, but a slight push of the oarlock's loop. It won't be my soul that the waters come to encompass, only a diary entry of everyday scope. A roll of thunder, the usual end of the line, and the catch of the day falls back to primordial brine. It won't be my soul that the waters come to swallow, since eternity has no use for this clotting of time.
Я отвечу морю внешнему, что оно не должно иметь значения, ибо дано, не идет в расчет, ибо вечно и неизменно, несущественно, ибо предопределено. Перелетные птицы, трава, говорок ручья существуют только в границах небытия и вполне статичной суммой своих мгновений составляют время, в котором двигаюсь я. Перечеркнута осень пестрым косым крылом, бересклет дорогу пробует на излом, и дымок над крышей не отменяет лето тем, что наполняет воздух своим теплом. И неважно, в который раз не уловит глаз то деленье, когда над берегом свет погас. Разночтения, помехи, штрихи, прорехи — это то, что в конце концов образует нас. Там, где внешнее море гоняет свои горбы, где на косогоре солнечные столбы, я отвечу, что в разреженном мироздании есть возможность существовать помимо судьбы. Ни надежда, ни познание добра и зла, а стежок уключенный, легкий толчок весла. То, что воды обнимут, не будет моей душою, только записью в дневнике от сего числа. Грозовой раскат, привычный конец всему, и добыча летит назад в придонную тьму. То, что воды возьмут, не будет моей душою. Это сгусток времени, вечности, ни к чему.
All right. Next is going to be DMITRY KUZMIN reading It's Easy to Hate Russia, with a translation read by James McGavran.
This translation was collaborated on by Michael Wachtel, Charles Bernstein, LEONID SCHWAB, Catherine O'Connor, and myself. It's easy to hate Russia from Latvia. It's easy to hate Russia from America. It's more or less easy to hate Russia from some parts of Ukraine. but from Crimea or Donbass, it's not so easy. It's relatively easy to hate Russia from Moscow. It's a lot less easy from Perm or Omsk, where they entertain locals with life-sized model gallows. It's not easy at all to hate Russia on a hunger strike in Labutnangi prison. Your head spins, weakness overpowers. Your fingers tingle, touch is numb. Your thirst is too great for water to quench.
Удобно ненавидеть Россию из Латвии. Удобно ненавидеть Россию из Америки. Более или менее удобно ненавидеть Россию из некоторых районов Украины, но из Крыма и из Донбасса не очень удобно. Сравнительно удобно ненавидеть Россию из Москвы. Гораздо неудобнее из Перми или Омска, где горожан развлекают моделью виселицы в натуральную величину. Очень неудобно ненавидеть Россию из Лабытнанги. Голова кружится, сильная слабость, покалывание в пальцах, онемение рук, сухость во рту постоянная. Не получается напиться водой.
Okay, next we're going to hear Galina Rymbu's World's Time, with translations of various of its parts read by Judith Dashevsky, Brian Kim, and Michael Wachtel.
Я читаю фрагмент, ты читаешь фрагмент на английском или на русском?
Фрагмент так или целый? Так. Окей, хорошо. World's time. Matter entered time, from which emerged exploding skin tones, speech apparatus, conditions of the earth.
Материя вошла во время. Оттуда возникло все. Взрыв кожи, устройство гортани, состояние земли.
And all became distinct, and then as before, but fractured into west and east.
Затем все различилось и стало прежним, но стало расколото на запад и восток.
And so the interwoven world appeared, and the language loom shuddered, from which sprang angels of skin.
И так появился связанный мир, и дрожал станок языка, когда к нему вышли оттуда ангелы кожи.
They saw how the world's time ladles boiling water from the crevice for survivors.
Они видели, как время мира дочерпывает из расщелины кипяток для выживших.
Dark oil of the dead, the groan of the pipeline, into the depths and the roar of war creatures. Some eat well, while others look on, as rebellion dies out at the borders of another mind.
Темное масло мертвых, стон трубопровода в недрах, и гул военных созданий. Одни едят хорошо, а другие смотрят, как на границах другого ума восстание вырождается.
The animals went blind that lay on the Sabbath's red book. The air swelled above the bay, fine black dust, the mind's bombed monastery.
Ослепли животные, что лежали на красной книге субботы. Воздух вздулся, над заливом мелкая черная пыль. Ума, взорванный монастырь.
Before the monastery there was time, and there was no good and evil. We were on the shuttle bus that looked on as that died out. And wanted to kill herself on the shuttle bus.
До монастыря было время, и не было добра и зла. Мы были в рейсовом автобусе. Она смотрела, как то вырождается, и хотела убить себя в рейсовом автобусе.
Where there is no good and evil, and nothing that can be done. Don't touch. Be gone, beyond safe touches. Without touching, be gone from the world.
Там, где нет добра и зла, и нет ничего, что можно сделать, не прикасайся, будь далеко, будь дальше, без опасного прикосновения, без прикосновений, будь далеко от мира.
Far from the world, like beasts we train our eyes, our gazes, far from the body where it's safe. From 6 directions from the borders, we speak about borders. We separate food of death and food of life, obtained simply from those who look on as we jostle for food below and embrace at night, hidden in our tent.
Вдалеке от мира, как звери, держим свои глаза, свои взгляды далеко от тела, в безопасности. С 6 сторон от границ говорим о границах, разделяем еду на мертвую и живую, полученную простым путем, от тех, что смотрят, как мы низко едим, толкаясь, как обнимаемся ночью в скрытом шатре.
Love set us apart from the world. It gave food and wealth to all poor people jammed into the world, jammed into one another in the subway, in bed, in coffins, jammed together in paupers' graves. What does our mind lack that we bang against walls, unable to comprehend how to put an end to this separation now?
Нас любовь отделила от мира. Она же дала еду и богатство всем бедным, вжатым в мир, вжатым друг в друга, в метро, в постели, в гробах, что вжаты друг в друга по бедности захоронения. Чем беден наш ум, что мы бьемся о стены, не умея понять, как прекратить это разделение. Сейчас.
Night, the hymn of cameras. The mind begins to move under the body's weight. Reason, child.
Ночь. Гимн камер. Ум приходит в движение под тяжестью тела. Рассудок. Ребенок.
And now we will have Val Vinacourt reading of the Father Tongue with a translation read by LEONID SCHWAB.
Of the Father Tongue. Never tempt a native language. Its roots are thin and deep. Just when you think the old words have forgotten you, then the summer poplars burst and you are tarred and feathered in a snow of slurry endings. Genitive, genitive, who owns whom? This is late June in Petersburg. There is no night to hide in here. In any case you live under the name of the Father, like an eel darting from its rock at curious hands. And now you've come back. Quick, open wide while the potato words are hot. Repeat after me. Preposition accepted. I take it all back. Petersburg, I don't want to be born just yet.
Отчего языка. Никогда не искушай родной язык. Корни его тонки и глубоки. Только подумаешь, что старые слова тебя позабыли, как вдруг летние тополя взрываются, и ты обмазан дегтем и вывален в пухе расплывчатых окончаний. Родительный, кто у кого? Конец июня в Питере. Здесь ночи нет, чтобы укрыться. Как ни склоняй, ты продолжаешь жить под именем отца. Выскакивать, как угорь из-под камня, к любопытным пальцам. И вот вернулся ты. Открывай скорее рот, пока слова «картофель» обжигают. Повторяй за мной. Предлоги приняты. Я все беру обратно. Петербург. Я еще не хочу рождаться. Еще нет.
And Julia Kalchinsky-Dasbach is going to read Other Women Don't Tell You, with a translation read once again by LEONID SCHWAB.
Other women don't tell you about the hair, how it falls out, webs between your fingers and in the shower, and clumps on your pillow and on the floor and in the hands of one who still loves you. They say it'll grow back, thicker even, but you don't believe them. They've lied before. And they don't tell you about the split, how you can fit a fist between your left and right sides. You can work to make it narrower, they say. Build back the muscles in your abdomen and pelvic floor. It just takes time. You can get it all back, they say, but you know that's not the point. And you knew you'd be tired, that the body can only keep up for so long. They warned you days would be long, but years would fly, and again they were wrong, because everything is flying and the rain is coming down the way July had never known it. And you think, my body was an ark once, and you ask, would it still float? And in days your son will have breathed air as long as water, and maybe Noah was a woman too. They never told you this, but the rain is coming and you are holding a wad of your own hair in one hand, and your son's head rests along the other, and you think they never told you any of this, how your hands would never keep up.
Другие женщины тебе не скажут. Про волосы, как они выпадают прядями у тебя между пальцев, змейками в душе и клочьями на твоей подушке, и на полу, и в руках того, кто по-прежнему любит тебя. Они говорят, еще отрастет, даже гуще, но ты им не веришь. Они тебя уже обманули, ничего не сказали о том, как мышцы расходятся в стороны, между половинками тела войдет кулак. Они говорят, все потом можно сузить, разработав мускулатуру передней стенки и тазового дна. Просто нужно время. Все можно остановить, они говорят, но ты понимаешь, дело не в этом. И ты знала, что будешь измучена, что тело не выдержит долго. Они тебя предупреждали, дни будут долгими, но годы потом полетят. И тут неправда. Летит совершенно все. Даже дождь так хлещет, как никогда не бывало в июле. И ты думаешь, мое тело однажды было ковчегом, поплывет ли оно опять? И сын твой уже дышит воздухом дольше, чем прежде водой. И, может быть, Ной тоже был женщиной? Они тебе никогда не рассказывали об этом. Но дождь подступает, и ты держишь в одной руке комок своих волос, а головка сына покоится на другой. И ты думаешь, они никогда не рассказывали ни о чем из этого. Твои руки просто не выдержат.
All right, and then the last poet will be LEONID SCHWAB, who's going to read On a Business Trip to a Nondescript Town, and I will join him to read the translation. Oh, I go first. It's the first time I'm reading here. All right, this was a translation that we worked on now 7 days ago at Princeton, because we've been doing this for 7 days. Or 6 days ago, I guess. And Sibyllin worked on it, Sibyllin Forrester, James McGavran, Catherine O'Connor, and Leonid was part of that discussion as well. These Manchurian plateaus call to mind Chkalov. Chkalov on the Shevchenko Heights has places just like that. When you first get to Manchuria, you feel down, unsure of yourself. You're reserved, not much to say. On the Shevchenko Heights, you feel better. It's Chkalov, after all. There's places just like that, reserved, not much to say.
Эти маньчжурские плато напоминают Чкалов. В Чкалове на Шевченковских точно такие места. В Маньчжурии с первых дней чувствуешь подавленность, неуверенность в себе. Ты немногословен, сдержан. На Шевченковских легче. Это же Чкалов. Точно такие места. Немногословен, сдержан. Спасибо.
Thank you. So I think now we want to have a discussion about translation. At some point, I think we want to maybe just explain what we've been doing a little bit. But I know that there are a couple of students here who translated, one student who translated that poem as well. I think it might be an interesting start for our discussion to hear that version of this poem. If the student, who is it? Is it the Dasha or the Lisa? I was told there was a Dasha and a Lisa. Dasha. And what's your last name? Excellent. Well, come on up and read it. Have a seat.
Так. Я, конечно, извиняюсь. Я не ожидала, что я буду читать вслух свою трансляцию, поэтому, может быть, это не самая лучшая трансляция. А мне по-английски? Да, ну, конечно, мне по-английски. Да, конечно, по-английски,
If you
да.
want to translate it back into Russian, you could read the
No, thank you.
retranslate.
I'm good, though. Thank you. Okay. These Manchurian plateaus are reminiscent of Chkalov. Chkalov's on Shevchenko's. Those are definitely the places. In Manchuria, from the first days, one feels a depression. Uncertainty in oneself. You are short-spoken, reserved. In Shevchenko's, it is easier. That is, after all, Chkalov. Surely those are the places, short-spoken, reserved.
Thank you. Excellent. Stay up here somewhere nearby.
What'd you say?
Stay up here somewhere nearby.
Oh, okay.
So we were going to talk about translation, but before I even start chit-chatting, maybe we could see if the audience has any questions that they want to start us on. So, do you? Audience? Speak up. Yes. Here, you can use this. The audience is actually mine, but you can use this for people who are close by.
Can we ask anything about the translation?
Anything.
Okay. Well, I was wondering about the of the father tongue. Or no. It's Easy to Hate Russia poem, because I thought it was interesting that the translation chosen was удобно and not легче. Because it's almost like they're saying that it's convenient to hate Russia rather than it's easier to do so.
Even comfortable.
Right, even comfortable. And I don't know if that's the message that the poet wanted to say, but I just didn't.
Well, we have the poet here. We can ask him.
I can also speak to that because
Take the mic.
I was the first translator of that poem, and in fact I wrote I think comfortable was the way I started. But then when we started discussing it, it seemed that удобно has some valence is that comfortable does not in English, and that was why we eventually went for easy, because it seemed more natural, just as the Russian udobne in that context really didn't. It does mean comfortable, but it also meant easy, so we opted for the one that would sort of work a little better in translation. But yes, you're absolutely right. It doesn't quite do the trick.
I mean, nothing does the trick. Nothing ever does the trick. Are there, Dmitry, do you have like insights into comfortable versus udobna and hatred for Russia?
You see, in general, one can only judge about these subtle things when it is about her mother tongue, basically. English is not my mother tongue, obviously. So I would say that within that convention of translating I belong to, which is more about domestication of a foreign piece of literature. If it sounds not quite comfortable with comfortable, it would be easier to use easy. So I trust my American colleagues about this choice.
I think, I mean, we should like explain these terms. Like there are a lot of people who are translating poetry in this room, obviously, and so the term domesticating and its typical, binary pair foreignizing are known terms, but these are terms which are used by translators and in translation theory to think about the process of translating literature into another language or anything into another language. Domesticating is when you take greater liberties in order to make the work look more like it was written in the language that you're translating into. And foreignizing is when you take the opportunity of translating something from a foreign language to mess with the language itself, to distort the language in a way that it wouldn't be naturally, it wouldn't be natural to do so. And there's a lot of discussion about those, two things. And there are people that feel very strongly about one or the other as practices, people who are, know the terms but are sanguine about going back and forth between the two. But it's like the obvious choice, the range of choice that you have when you're translating. Other questions? I'm not sure, also adding to that, I think we were mostly domesticating here. But there were a few places where there was a lot of foreignizing going on. So I'm not sure that there was like a typical practice. I don't know, James was frowning. You think we were more foreignizing than domesticating?
Well, I mean, it depends on how far you want to go with domesticating. Like Chkalov, no one's ever heard of Chkalov. You could have said like Idaho or something, that and I don't think anyone would have wanted to do that,
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
Except that, for instance, Dash's version, right? So on the Shevchenkos, that's clearly a very foreignizing move. Whereas we invented this term on the Shevchenko heights just to make it work in English. So they're, but it's always a range. Do you guys have other questions? Yes.
So would you say it's easier to sound more tragic in English when translating from Russian than sound funny? Because, for instance, in Dmitry's poem, I think there was a lot of irony and sarcasm, but I mostly heard tragedy in English. But I heard a sarcastic poem rendered as a tragic one in English.
I don't know, I'm going to throw that back at the translators. I felt like, that repeated formula and the way that it's structured, it's hard for that poem to be anything but kind of sarcastic and ironic and kind of funny, even in the English version. But I also think that, anything about suffering in Russia that you translate into English will ring tragic for, the New York Times op-ed writers. So, even if it, do you know what I mean? Yeah. There's Russia is typecast into the place of deep suffering, especially now.
I think
so
it's hard to write amusingly in English about a hunger strike.
Yeah.
Well, the part about the hunger strike is not amusing. I think he did it.
No.
Yeah, when you get to the end, it's like it strikes home.
Right.
Which is, yeah, it's how it works as a poem, right? It starts out looking a little funny, but by the end, it's like dead serious. I don't know. Does anyone else have did you feel the humor? You people hearing it for the first time in the first half of the poem, Mila?
In Russian version or
In the English version.
In English, no, because of the word. It's easy. If it would be, it's convenient. I would feel irony then right away. Right? Easy and it's easy. It's just not.
Yeah, maybe convenient is like a little bit more.
Or I don't know. Maybe it's a different. Should be different word in English, but there is irony. I think in.
Udobnost.
Udobno, right? Yeah.
Maybe, yeah, maybe we lost a little of the irony with the easy translate. Speaking of domestication and foreignizing, and this easy to, and it's, so the word for domesticating in Russian is, what is it again? Domestifikatsiya? Domestikatsiya просто. It's domestikatsiya, but the word for foreignizing is foreignizing. Foreignizatsiya. Одомашнивание. But when I asked you the translation at the start, you said domestikatsiya и foreignizatsiya. And foreignizatsiya is a much more foreignizing term than domestikatsiya.
Но я бы говорил, конечно, про одомашнивание.
Одомашнивание is better.
Вот. При том, что
they're both foreignizing.
слово домашний это не только иностранный, но и дикий. Like wild. Wild foreign poetry should be domesticated.
So we should actually have dickificatia. Are there other questions? Yes, in the back.
I was wondering about how closely you try to follow the structure of the poem, like itself, in terms of meter, internal rhyme. I noticed with the one about Shikala that reminded me, I don't know if it was exactly a pantoum, but it was sort of similar to a pantoum. How closely do you try to follow those things when you translate?
So I'll answer for myself. Like Russian is a very strict syllabotonic versification system for formal poetry that simply does not exist in English. We do have syllabic lines, but English iambs work nothing like Russian iambs, right? Because you can move the stress around a lot, and there are lots of secondary stresses. So when I'm translating, I try to do lines that are similar in terms of their rhythmic construction within the bounds of English prosody. If you try to do precise, some kind of an equivalent of a Russian meter in English, what you end up with is children's verse or light verse, which are the only genres in English where you get extraordinarily strong and fixed, meters, right? Such a wonderful bird is the pelican, for its beak can hold more than its pelican, right? But you can only do that in light verse in English because it always sounds funny, or in children's verse, right? Dr. Seussy stuff. So that's my answer, but I think other people have different answers, and so I don't know. I see a lot of people over here.
I want to answer that because ELENA MIKHAILIK's poem, of which I read the translation, is Rubaiyat style. So if you know the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which was very, 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 very famous, I think, in the 19th century and stayed kind of washed over into the 20th, so your grandparents might have it on their bookshelf, is well enough known. So you've heard this, a loaf of bread, a jug of wine, and thou, right? That's a line from that. And so we were trying to keep the rhyme scheme because even though it's unusual in English, if someone knows that work, they'll say, aha, that's the meter. Or not the meter, but
Julia had an idea, and then we have several people with
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, because you asked specifically about a pontoon, we didn't read it today, but yesterday there was a group of 5 translators spending 4 hours plus to translate a pontoon a villanelle from English into Russian, and it proved very complicated because the structure of villanelle and pontoon is dependent on retaining the exact same word, right? But that word shifting in meaning. And whereas that is very prevalent in English. Based on kind of the discussion we had, is that English, in terms of its lexicon, is a more poor language, I think. There's one word and it has 10,000 little implications, whereas Russian is a super rich language. While one word can also have a lot of different implications.
Одно слово для штопора, super rich.
There's only one word for corkscrew in English.
I guess that's true. But there's more abstractions, abstract
Russian.
words. So it was difficult to use the same word and have it mean something different. So the forms like Pontoum and Villanelle are not popular in Russian verse, whereas they're very popular to English, French.
I saw also, so like Leonid and Michael and Val had some ideas about this, so I don't know who was first.
Okay, just generally, what really helped me personally to participate is the right beginning, I guess. It's to say the conversion is impossible. Meaning, sound, just impossible. It's understood. Let's do it. That's my approach and really helped.
Michael and Val?
I was just going to say, as far as the iams, it depends who's the poet writing. If you read Elegy in a Country Churchyard, you'll discover that same very insistent pattern of iams. If you read Milton or someone like that, you will discover very different iams. But more to the point is that the poets who were here did not write in iams. Most wrote in free verse, but sometimes people wrote with rhymes, and that is, of course, a great difficulty because rhyming in Russian is actually considerably easier than in English. And in some cases, we had English poems that rhymed, and they went incredibly beautifully into Russian, to the point that you almost couldn't believe it was a translation. Whereas whenever you try to do it the other way, it's super difficult and usually quite clunky.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and then one other thing we could say about that formal stuff is, like, we don't have Eugene with us today, but, like, you know, one of his, like, formal, I think, projects over the course of his career has been making it possible to do things with rhythm and rhyme in English that come from other traditions, including the Russian tradition, which meant, in a weird way, that when his stuff was being translated back into Russian, it seemed like it was like returning into a language where it just made sense formally in a way that it doesn't, and intentionally doesn't, in English. So.
Right. Yeah. which yeah. Now I feel like Leonid read it. I feel like Leonid read my poem in the original. So, but what I wanted to go back to the question about form, and specifically because Sibyl and I ended up translating a bunch of Lena's poems, all of which are formal, at least the ones that I worked on. So the one that Sibyl read, we indeed tried to keep the Rubaiyat form because that's what was being evoked. But then in another of her poems, we ended up keeping some of the rhyme, but not all of it, right? Because we felt that it needed to have some of that formal sense, but that the specific rhyme pattern wasn't central to that poem, right? And then we translated another poem that had a fairly normal rhyme scheme in Russian, but because of the tone of the poem, we decided to make it more rhymey in English. So we essentially turned it into a limerick in order to capture the tone of the poem, and we thought that worked well. So in other words, the structure has to connect in some way to the overall organic, holistic art.
Yeah, if it's funny, you can make it as bouncy and rhymey as you want in English, and it's
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions? Like this, we've sort of touched on the other sort of binary coordinates, which are often applied to translation, especially of poetry, right? This idea that there's form and there's meaning, and that the two things are, either at cross purposes, you've got to make a choice about like, are you going to translate for meaning, or you're going to translate for form? And if you translate for form, then you're going to distort the meaning, and if you translate for meaning, then you're going to lose the form, which is maybe an appropriate optics in some way to take, except that you're always losing the form, and you're always losing the meaning. So you've got to keep that in mind too, right? The only complete, accurate translation of a poem is just to do it again exactly as it was done, right? The Don Quixote Borges one, where you just write the whole thing again. Rendering a poem into another language is never a process of like some kind of matrix of equivalencies that produces something which is the same, because that's the whole point. It's not the same in either form or in meaning. Other questions?
I have one more question. So in this country, you have a songwriter who won a Nobel Prize in literature. So in that case, why can't you translate rhymed poems as song lyrics?
Sure can.
Yeah. So you're suggesting they won't sound right, and yet the Nobel Committee admitted that this songwriter, Bob Dylan, is actually a literary person.
Yeah.
Even though he wrote
sure.
song lyrics.
I don't.
A number of strange choices.
But I mean, like, sure. I mean,
But Dylan
I don't think
writes
that that's at
only-
crop purposes with anything anyone is saying here, actually.
Just to say, Dylan only writes all of his songs, majority are ballads. So that's
Right.
one particular form. And to say all Russian poetry is also a ballad wouldn't necessarily work. I think that, like Onegin, rhyme is completely different and not meant as song.
And song lyrics in general are, it's not just that they rhyme or they slant rhyme, but that because they're sung, they're spread out, they're oral. It's very different from reading something on a page. So you can compare a song lyric to poetry that was maybe written for the page, but in an era where books were very expensive, and so you either memorized it or you read it aloud to your family. And then there's that moment where suddenly publishing becomes more widespread, literacy is very widespread, and suddenly poetry for the page, for the eye instead of the ear, becomes a thing. I think it's Steiner talks about the astringency of modernism. It loses sentimentality, and so suddenly for the Victorian woman to write about her dead baby in very sentimental terms, and people would read it and cry, becomes laughable, because if you look at it on the page versus hearing it, or reading it slowly because you just learned to read, or hearing it read aloud, it's a completely different vосприятие.
Yeah, I think I would just like, if you're going to include your definition of poetry to include song, which is fine. Song is a different genre than printed lyric poetry, and there are different rules and conventions relating to what you can do and what you can't. But like, pop song obviously has got a lot of rhyme. But lyric poetry as it stands in the United States right now doesn't. So, but I don't think that changes the general questions much. And yeah, children's verse has a lot of rhyme, and adult verse doesn't. It's just like these are the coordinates that you have to work with when you're translating into a different tradition. Other questions?
I would add something to this discussion, although it might not lead us to any practical solution. See, from the theoretical point of view, and well, in one of my lives, I am a scholar studying like verse theory and such things. You can see there is not such a thing like a separated form and contents, right?
Yeah.
So the basic question for any political form is how it contributes to the contents of the poem. And it contributes not only by referring to other poems written this way in centuries, although this is important sometimes, like you have mentioned about this referring to Omar Khayyam, and maybe not exactly to Omar Khayyam, not necessarily to Omar Khayyam, but to a certain tradition of connected with it. That is absolutely true. but still the work of form in this given poem is the main thing in question. How this rhyme, how this rhythm, how this syllabic structure contributes to what emotion, what feeling, what worldview this poem is proposing. And in this aspect, omitting the form is in fact omitting a good deal of contents.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's pretty possible that this imperative of preserving the formal structures wouldn't work as long as a reader in the receiving culture wouldn't grasp it anyway.
Right, or it's, I mean, once again, it's to think that the formal structures in the target language are part of the meaning structure that you're translating into. So you're finding formal structures which at least will not detract from or contradict the original meaning, but possibly could duplicate it in some way as a translation act.
So it means that in a sense, we know in advance that what we are going to get in the receiving language is not what we had. It's just a recreated thing. Maybe it's not a good news, right? And well, we in Russia mostly are trying to preserve any kind of form as far as it is possible, even by means of inventing some formal structures, like not represented in the history and presently own practice of Russian poetry. So I mean that ideally it would be a better solution. But this idea implies that the literary community should have a great impact towards the standards of perception, proclaiming the idea that reading poetry in translation must be based on different presuppositions than reading original poetry in your own language. That, in particular, that the formal conventions there might be completely different, and one has to keep it in mind. Is it possible, maybe, to advertise, let me say it this way, this general approach of, is it a foreignization by the way, or not? This idea that we have to be prepared to grasp this translated poem is based on the conventions we might not have in use in our own culture.
Other questions?
A question just occurred to me. I was thinking as Dmitry was talking that I think as translators, well, I know. Let me just speak for myself. I've had the fantasy that a translated text would somehow live within the tradition of the. I mean, I translated into English, so it would somehow actually become a part of the English tradition. And there's certainly moments in time when this has happened in the Russian tradition, the English tradition, like where a translation contributes enormously to the native tradition. I'm wondering when the last time that happened was.
You mean for
I
English?
think of like, for either English or Russian. Because King James Bible or something, maybe, or
For sure, but
you have
Ezra
Zhukovsky making these
Pound's
translations.
Cafe, which is a horrible translation if you judge it as a translation, and a wonderful collection of somewhat.
I think, very often you get these, like when the great poet starts translating, you get the texts which become extraordinarily important in the tradition. So I'm thinking about like Pasternak's Shakespeare translations, which are extraordinarily important and, cited.
Is that a goal, though, actually? I mentioned, I'm not saying I'm thinking that every time I translate a text I wanted to, do this, but does it matter at all, that consideration?
It's, you have to sort of imagine a living and, commonly shared poetic tradition. And I'm not sure that we're in a world where the world is divided up into these national traditions with, robust, shared common canons anymore, so that like the United States is like really a patchwork of many different sort of poetic communities, and there is not a national canon. I don't think anything that we're doing is going to be something that all school children will learn in 50 years, in the same way that you could say that someone like T.S. Eliot wrote poems that all school children were expected to learn 40 or 50 years on after that. So it's like a different kind of a situation in thinking about how a text can contribute to a tradition somehow. But maybe that's just my view. And in Russia, it might be different still, although I think that in Russia too, the poetic culture is fragmenting into lots of different communities of readers as opposed to a single overall one. But then the advantage too is I really do feel like there's a lot of sort of cosmopolitan interaction, the kinds of interconnections between poetic communities of different languages, which have been created by electronic communication and sort of globalization networks like this one, right? So I feel like there are a lot of very tight connections between New York avant-garde poetic community, especially around the Presse, and the poets that we have translated here, and like Moscow, St. Petersburg avant-garde poetic communities, which is not something that existed before. So it's a different matrix. I think you're not hit by the mic here.
Okay. I guess I wanted to address that question just from another angle, which is that on the one hand, as a translator working today, you can't have that. That would be kind of a ridiculous ambition, for all the reasons that Kevin just mentioned. There's too many texts and too many different traditions. Maybe Robert Alter's Genesis might achieve some kind of status, down the road. Maybe not. It has the potential, but I know that, just speaking for myself as a translator, my own personal ambition when I'm translating something very difficult, which I guess that's kind of the only thing worth translating, is that I'm trying to build up a kind of a tertium quid, a third thing that's not the original, and that is not that's not something that you would have encountered yet, or it doesn't sound like anything you would have encountered yet in the target language, in English. So in other words, but something that you could encounter. So in other words, ideally every translation should be completely original from the point of view of you as a writer writing a text, right? And as far as I'm concerned, that would, or at least should be, the only thing that might have the potential of becoming canonical in the target language 10 years from now, or 1,000 years from now, or whatever. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's...
No, it does, yeah. The ambition to become a part of the canon, I agree, that's absurd. I don't think that's what I meant. That probably is what I said, but like, to make it so that there is some point for someone who has access to the original text to read your translation as well. I mean,
Yes.
That's scaling it back. You know,
So that's the paradox, because at the same time, you are the translation is primarily for someone who doesn't read the original, right? But at the same time, yes, I agree. Ideally there should be some point for someone who can to read your translation.
Which pushes you back towards like highly foreignizing and like not even just foreignizing, but like adaptations or recreation, like not like Emily Wilson's Homer, but Derek Walcott's Homeros, right?
Or in Carson's translation of the Sappho fragment.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a great example where she's foreignizing, but at the same time, it's very
Creating.
much a part of the lyric contemporary canon.
Yeah.
Although she can get away with whatever she does brilliantly, because there are so many others that if you want to say, okay, how does this compare? 50 other
Prose, verse,
yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, Alex.
I have a question to translators who usually work individually about the experience of the last week of working in collectively and also with a poet present where you can ask questions about that.
It was like having extra brains. It was so wonderful. And maybe I was just lucky because every group I was in, people were very generous. And, so the ideas would crackle around the space, and different people, someone who'd sat quiet for a while would have the very best suggestion because they'd been plunged into that question. Whereas when you sit by yourself, you need to wait until later. So I think what this did, and probably this is the intention, is it speeds up that process. That I tell my students it always takes longer than you think it will. It purposely and then they don't believe me, and then it does take longer than they think. But if you come back to it in 3 months, you're in a different place and you have those other ideas. But maybe even then not as widely ranging. And to have someone like Renia come and sort of throw in unexpected, crazy suggestions that some of which you would think, maybe not, and others of which were just funny and perfect, even who hadn't participated in the complete discussion, to make a rhyming translation much more funny. That was also, so not just working in the group, but also having someone else giving comments.
Other thoughts on that question? I mean, when we first started doing it this way, I don't think we knew how it was going to work, but I think we anticipated a lot more conflict than actually has turned out to be. I'm not quite sure why, but it seems to work very well. And the other, one rule that I realized over the years is that if you actually put a bunch of people together around a blank screen and ask them to translate together, even if you tell them this is just the rough draft, they can't really do that. That there has to be a bad rough draft for people to talk about together before you can put the people together to have the discussion. That's like an important first stage. It doesn't matter. It could be a good first draft too, but I mean, but a first draft that people are, not so attached to that they feel overwhelmed when they're overwritten by the group. But you can always keep multiple drafts, right? You can save your thing somewhere else if you don't want other people to fix it.
We did Google Translate to one of the poems, and that proved disastrous. So yes, a rough draft.
And it was also the villanelle, which in and of itself a difficult task.
We had some people start with Google Translates the first Your Language My Year in 2011, and it worked fine as a starting point for some poems. Swarovski was translated that way. But I mean, that was just the starting point. Other questions? Well, I think then maybe we should, sorry, one more. Yeah.
Are you going to do this in future? Or are you too exhausted to contemplate right now?
I think it should happen again in some, way, shape, or form, but we haven't really given any thought to that. But, every couple of years we should do this, I think. I like doing it. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all right. Yeah. We have to like get all this stuff published, you know, so we have to start like the publication phase of the project. And then when we're done with that, we can come back to the translation phase. But it takes a little while to get things placed. So thank you all for coming, and thank everyone for taking part in this like incredible adventure this week. It's been really, really fun. And there's, I'm sure, tons more salad back in there. Is that right?
Absolutely.
So go get some more salad. And I think we'll be hanging out here for another, you know, at least 30 minutes. So if you have more individual questions for some of the poets, feel free to pose those as well. Thanks for coming.